Imagine the moment before your alarm goes off, that warm, drowsy buffer between sleep and consciousness, where you're still cocooned in your blanket, where the world hasn't quite found you yet. Now erase it completely. Because in the stone chamber of a medieval castle, there is no gentle transition. There's only the violent clang of a bell echoing through corridors, the rough hand of your squire shaking your shoulder, and the immediate shocking awareness that the air in your room is cold enough to see your breath. Your body, which spent the night curled beneath wool blankets that smell faintly of lanolin and smoke, protests every movement. The straw mattress beneath you has compressed into uncomfortable lumps. Your back aches, your neck is stiff, and you haven't even put on 60 pounds of metal yet. Welcome to your life as a medieval knight, or rather welcome to the approximately 16 hours you'll survive before begging for your heated apartment and smartphone back. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The squire, a teenage boy named Osbert, who resents you almost as much as you're about to resent this entire experience, is already moving through the chamber, and he's not being gentle about it. He's yanking open the wooden shutters, letting in the pale, grudging light of a winter dawn that looks more like dusk. The castle is already awake around you. You can hear the distant clatter of the kitchen, the low voices of guards changing. Watch the scrape of a shovel in the courtyard below where someone is mucking out the stables. The day has started without you, and in the rigid hierarchy of medieval life, being late is not a personal failing, it's a social catastrophe. You swing your legs out of bed and your feet meet the stone floor. It's like stepping onto a block of ice. The chamber you sleep in, if you can even call this sparse drafty box a chamber, has no heating, except whatever warmth might drift up from the great hall below. There's a brazier in the corner, but it died sometime in the night, and now it's just a bowl of grey ash that smells faintly of old smoke and regret. You're wearing a linen shift that you slept in, and it's damp with sweat despite the cold, because that's what happens when you pile wool blankets on top of yourself in a desperate attempt to survive the night. Medieval beds are not comfortable, they're survival equipment. Osbert is already laying out your clothes on the wooden chest at the foot of your bed, the only furniture in here besides the bed itself, and a small table holding a basin of the water that's certainly frozen over. He doesn't ask if you slept well. He doesn't make small talk. He's been up for an hour already preparing for this moment, and his day will be even longer than yours. The life of a squire is essentially indentured servitude, with better branding. He'll dress you, arm you, feed you clean up after you maintain your equipment, and he'll do all of it while training to eventually become a knight himself, at which point he'll finally get his own resentful teenager to boss around. It's the circle of medieval life. You stumble toward the basin, but Osbert is already there, cracking the ice with the pommel of a dagger. The water underneath is shockingly cold, and when you splash it on your face, it feels like a slap. This is your morning routine cold water, no soap worth mentioning, and the growing awareness that you have at least 14 more hours of this ahead of you. Your modern self, the one that is used to hot showers and coffee, and scrolling through your phone for 20 minutes before fully committing to consciousness, is already whimpering in a corner of your mind. But here's the thing about being a medieval knight that nobody tells you in the stories: it's not actually about the battles. It's not even mostly about the battles. It's about this brutal grinding routine of simply maintaining yourself and your equipment and your position in a world that will forget you the moment you show weakness. The poets sing about valor and glory. They don't sing about standing in a freezing chamber at dawn, while a teenager judges your body with the clinical detachment of someone who's about to spend the next 40 minutes turning you into a walking tin can. Osbert gestures impatiently toward the chest. You're expected to stand there while he begins the process. You're expected to hold your arms out like a scarecrow. You're expected to endure, and the sun, that pale excuse for warmth, is barely clearing the horizon. The bells ring again, second call. You're already behind schedule. The first piece Osbert lifts isn't even armour, it's an arming doublet, a padded jacket that will sit between your skin and the metal that's about to encase you. He holds it open, and you slide your arms into the sleeves, feeling the weight of it settle on your shoulders. It's quilted linen stuffed with wool or horsehair, and it's already stiff with dried sweat from yesterday. Medieval knights don't have closets full of fresh clothes. You have maybe 2 or 3 of these doublets, and you wear them in rotation until they literally fall apart. The smell is what hits you first, a mixture of your own body odour, the lanolin from the wool, and something mustier, something that speaks to the fact that this garment has been worn hard and washed rarely. Osbert begins lacing it tight up the front, pulling the cords with practiced efficiency that borders on aggression. You can feel your ribs compress slightly. This isn't clothing, it's structural support for what comes next. Next come the arming hose, essentially padded tights that tie to the doublet at several points. Osbert is already kneeling, guiding your feet into them, pulling them up your legs with the bored expression of someone who's done this 1,000 times. You're standing there in what amounts to medieval long underwear, and you're already starting to sweat despite the cold. The room temperature hasn't changed, but your body's beginning to understand what's about to happen, and it's preemptively panicking. Good instincts. Now, the metal begins. Osbert starts with your feet. The Sabaton's articulated steel shoes that look like something a mechanical crab would wear. Each one has 6 or 7 overlapping plates that allow your foot to flex theoretically, though in practice, they're going to make you walk like you're perpetually trudging through mud. He buckles them over your arming shoes and you immediately feel the weight. Each Sabaton is maybe 2 pounds, which doesn't sound like much, until you remember you're going to be walking, running, climbing and fighting in these things for the next 12 hours. Your calves are already tired and you haven't taken a step. The greaves come next, shin guards that wrap around your lower legs and buckle at the side. More weight. Then the cuisses for your thighs, the polins for your knees. Osbert is working methodically, starting from the ground and building upward, and you're starting to understand why this process takes 40 minutes. Each piece has to be positioned correctly, buckled, securely adjusted so it doesn't pinch or gap. If your knee armour sits too low, you won't be able to bend your leg properly. Too high, and it'll dig into your thigh every time you take a step. Osbert knows this. He's made these mistakes before, and he's felt your wrath when armour failure in training led to an unnecessary bruise or worse. Your arms are next. Vambraces for your forearms, couters for your elbows, re-braces for your upper arms. Each piece is cold to the touch, that deep bone-level cold that metal holds in winter. The steel hasn't been near a fire this morning, and it's going to take at least an hour of wearing it before your body heat warms it to something approaching tolerable. Until then, it's like being embraced by a very unfriendly refrigerator. The articulation at your elbows is impressive. Actually, some armour spent weeks making sure these joints would move smoothly, filing and adjusting, until the plates slid over each other with minimal friction. But impressive doesn't mean comfortable. You can feel every edge, every buckle strap, every point where metal meets padded fabric. The cuirass, your breastplate and backplate, is the centerpiece, and it's the heaviest single component. Osbert lifts it with both hands, positions it over your head, and lets it settle onto your shoulders. The weight is immediate and undeniable. 20 pounds, maybe 25, distributed across your torso. Your spine compresses slightly. Your breathing changes. You can't take deep breaths anymore because the metal won't let your ribs expand fully. This is by design. A well-fitted cuirass should feel snug like a steel corset, because any gap between the armour and your body is a gap where a weapon can find purchase. Osbert begins buckling the straps at your sides, pulling them tight, and you feel the cuirass lock into place. You are quite literally trapped inside a metal shell. Modern people think of armour as protection, which it is, but they don't think about the cost. You've just added 40 pounds to your body weight, and you haven't even put on the helmet yet. Your shoulders are already aching. Your lower back is starting to protest. And here's the part that nobody tells you. You can't just take this off when you get tired. Once you're armoured, you're committed. Taking it off requires Osbert's help and another 40 minutes you don't have. Knights who need to urinate during a battle sometimes just do it. Right there in the armour. The smell is part of the job. The gorget collar of articulated steel that protects your neck is next. Osbert fastens it around your throat and you immediately feel claustrophobic. You can't turn your head fully anymore. Looking to the side requires turning your entire upper body. Looking down is an exercise in frustration. You're going to spend the entire day with limited peripheral vision, and in a world where threats can come from any direction, this is terrifying. Gauntlets next. These are marvels of medieval engineering, fingered gloves made of overlapping steel plates that somehow allow you to grip a sword while protecting your hands. Osber slides them on, lacing them tight at the wrists, and you flex your fingers experimentally. They move barely, like your hands are encased in very expensive oven mitts. Fine manipulation is impossible. You couldn't pick up a coin if your life depended on it. But you can hold a weapon, and in the medieval world that's the only dexterity that matters. Finally the helmet. Osbert lifts it a great helm or bassinet depending on what you can afford and lowers it over your head. The world immediately shrinks. Your vision is reduced to whatever you can see through the visor slit, a narrow horizontal opening that gives you maybe 120 degrees of horizontal vision, and almost nothing vertically. The helmet smells like metal, and old leather, and your own stale breath. It's lined with padding, but it still weighs 8 or 9 pounds, and all of that weight is balanced on top of your skull. Your neck is already starting to strain. Osbert steps back, examining his work. You're fully armoured now, a complete harness as they called it. 60 pounds of steel. You try to take a step and it's like moving through water. Everything is harder. Everything takes more energy. Your modern body used to t-shirts and sneakers is screaming at you to abort this mission immediately. But the day hasn't even started yet. You need to piss. Desperately. The problem is you're currently wearing approximately 60 pounds of metal that's been buckled, strapped and laced onto your body with the kind of security usually reserved for restraining dangerous criminals. Osbert looks at you with the weary expression of someone who has seen this panic before. He doesn't offer to help you remove the armour, there isn't time, and you both know it. Instead, he gestures toward a wooden bucket in the corner of the chamber, partially hidden behind a moth-eaten curtain. This is your latrine. This is everyone's latrine. Privacy is a concept that won't be invented for another few centuries. You waddle toward the bucket, there's no other word for how you move in full armour, and begin the awkward process of trying to access your own body through layers of steel and padding. The cuirass has a fold, a skirt of articulated plates that hangs down to protect your groin and upper thighs. It's designed to allow movement, but what it doesn't allow is easy access to the very human need to urinate. You're fumbling with straps and padding your gauntleted fingers, making everything 10 times harder, and Osbert has diplomatically turned his back to examine your sword with sudden intense interest. When you finally manage to relieve yourself, a process that takes 3 times longer than it should and requires contortions that would impress a circus performer, you realise the bucket is already half full. It hasn't been emptied from yesterday, maybe not from the day before. The smell rises up to meet you sharp and ammoniated, and you understand viscerally that medieval hygiene is not a euphemism or an exaggeration. It's a daily assault on your modern sensibilities. The waste in this bucket will eventually be carried down to the castle's cesspit, a charming hole in the ground that's probably located somewhere beneath the kitchen. because medieval sanitation planning was more aspirational than effective. There's a basin on the wooden table, the same one Osbert cracked the ice from earlier, and you move toward it, hoping to wash your hands. The water is still shockingly cold, and there's no soap. Well, there's something that might be called soap, a gritty lump of fat mixed with wood ash that removes dirt, mostly through abrasion. You scrub your hands with it, and your skin immediately feels raw. The gauntlets make this process nearly impossible anyway, so you give up halfway through. Medieval knights did not have soft hands. They had scarred, calloused, perpetually dirty hands that carried the residue of leather and metal and horse and worse. Your face is next. You splash more cold water on your cheeks, trying to shock yourself into full wakefulness. There's no mirror-polished metal if you're wealthy, nothing at all if you're not. But you can imagine what you look like. Your hair, which you haven't cut in months because barbers are expensive, and often double as surgeons, with terrifying results, is matted and greasy. You haven't washed it in weeks. The modern concept of shampooing daily would strike a medieval person as dangerously excessive, possibly even health-threatening. Water in the hair in winter. Are you trying to catch a fatal chill? Instead, you occasionally rub your scalp with linen cloths to absorb some of the oil, which mostly just redistributes the grease. Your teeth are another matter entirely. You have a chew stick, a frayed twig from an oak tree that you rub against your teeth, and gums in a primitive form of brushing. It doesn't really clean so much as massage, and it definitely doesn't address the larger problem your diet is destroying your mouth. The bread you eat is full of grit from the millstone that ground the grain. Every bite slowly files down your tooth enamel. You're probably in your late 20s and you've already lost one molar. By 40, if you live that long, you'll be lucky to have half your teeth. The nobility had slightly better dental outcomes than peasants, mostly because they could afford softer foods, but nobody had good teeth. Medieval smiles were gap-toothed disasters, and breath was universally appalling. Osbert hands you a cloth to dry your face, and you notice his fingernails. They're black with grime, split and ragged. Yours are no better. Under the gauntlets, your fingers are already developing calluses on top of calluses, from sword grips, from rains, from the constant friction of leather and metal. You have small cuts that never quite heal scrapes that have become infected and then healed badly, leaving white scars across your knuckles. Your hands tell the story of your profession, and it's not a pleasant narrative. The communal latrine is downstairs in a small stone room that projects out from the castle wall. It's called a garderobe, which sounds far more elegant than it is. The design is actually clever, a stone seat with a hole that drops straight down the exterior wall into the moat or cesspit below. In theory, waste falls harmlessly away. In practice, the walls are streaked with evidence of poor aim and architectural miscalculation. The smell is concentrated enough to make your eyes water. There's no toilet paper, of course, that won't exist for centuries. Instead, there are communal sponges on sticks that soak in a bucket of vinegar water between uses. You and a dozen other men share these sponges. Think about that for a moment. Really let it sink in. You don't bother going down to the garderobe this morning, the bucket in your chamber will have to suffice, but you know you'll have to make the journey later possibly, while still in full armour, which will require Osbert's assistance and public acknowledgement of your bodily functions. Privacy, dignity. The basic modern expectation that your bathroom habits are your own business. All of these dissolve in medieval life. You urinate, defecate and bathe, rarely in the company of others. The castle's garrison shares facilities without shame, because shame requires the luxury of alternatives. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely unbothered by these conditions, or whether they simply developed psychological coping mechanisms that allowed them to tolerate the intolerable. Some scholars point to the elaborate codes of courtesy in noble households as evidence that medieval people did value cleanliness and privacy, They just define these concepts very differently than we do. Others suggest that the omnipresent smell of unwashed bodies, animal waste and rotting food created a kind of olfactory numbness, a sensory adaptation that allowed people to function in conditions that would incapacitate a modern person within hours. Either way, you're standing in a cold stone chamber, in pre-dawn darkness, encased in metal, smelling of sweat, and worse, and you haven't even had breakfast yet. Your modern hygiene routine, shower, shampoo, deodorant, toothpaste, clean clothes, is so far removed from your current reality that it might as well be science fiction. Osbert is waiting by the door. The bells have rung third call. The castle is fully awake now, and you're expected in the Great Hall. Time to move. The Great Hall smells like smoke-wet dog and disappointment. You clank down the stone stairs, each step a careful negotiation between gravity and 60 pounds of armour, and push through the heavy wooden door into the cavernous space where the household gathers for the morning meal. Except meal is a generous term for what's about to happen. You're not getting eggs Benedict and fresh squeezed orange juice. You're getting survival rations, and you're getting them quickly because the lord of this castle believes that idle hands are the devil's workshop and fed knights are expensive knights. The trestle tables are already crowded with men-at-arms, other knights' servants, and the general chaos of a medieval household coming to life. Osbert guides you toward your designated spot. The seating arrangements are not casual suggestions. They're rigid social maps that tell everyone exactly where they stand in the hierarchy. You're somewhere in the middle, not high enough to sit near the Lord's table on the dais, but not so low that you're crammed in with the common soldiers near the door where the draught is worst. You lower yourself onto the bench and the wood creaks alarmingly under your armoured weight. Sitting in full harness is an art form. You can't really bend at the waist anymore, so you sort of collapse in a controlled fall. Breakfast arrives. A servant, a girl, maybe 12 years old with hollow cheeks and suspicious eyes, places a wooden bowl in front of you and sloshes something grey and lumpy into it. This is pottage, the omnipresent stew that forms the backbone of medieval cuisine. Yesterday's pottage specifically reheated and thinned with water because the kitchen is not wasting good stock on the morning meal. It contains barley, dried peas, some unidentifiable vegetables that have been boiled into submission, and possibly chunks of meat, though you suspect what you're looking at is more gristle and fat than actual protein. It tastes like salted sadness. Beside the bowl she places a trencher, a thick slice of stale bread that serves as both plate and food. The bread is several days old, hard enough to hammer nails, and it's been sitting in the bread box absorbing the ambient moisture and smells of the kitchen. You're supposed to soak it in the pottage until it softens, then eat it along with the stew. This is the medieval version of soggy cereal, except the milk is vegetable water, and the cereal is bread that could double as a weapon. There's also ale, a full tankard of it, lukewarm and slightly sour. This is not the craft beer you're imagining with hints of caramel and citrus. This is small ale, a low-alcohol brew that's safer to drink than water, because the brewing process kills most of the bacteria that would otherwise give you dysentery. It tastes like liquid bread with a faint bitter aftertaste, and you're going to drink at least 3 tankards of it today because dehydration in armour is a real and dangerous problem. The alcohol content is low enough that you won't get drunk, but high enough that by midday you'll have a permanent slight buzz that passes for normal consciousness in medieval life. You try to eat the pottage, but here's the problem: you're wearing gauntlets. Armoured gloves designed to protect your hands in combat are not designed for delicate dining. You can barely grip the wooden spoon, and when you do manage to get it to your mouth, half the pottage slides off before it arrives. You're essentially trying to eat soup while wearing oven mitts. Around you, other knights have removed their gauntlets. They've been at this game longer than you, and understand that dignity and nutrition rarely coexist. You fumble with the laces, finally yank them off, and immediately feel the cold air on your sweaty hands. Relief and discomfort in equal measure. The pottage is barely warm. The kitchen fires have been banked overnight and are only now being built back up, so everything served at breakfast exists in this weird, lukewarm state that maximizes the experience of congealed fat and limp vegetables. You force yourself to eat because you know from yesterday's brutal lesson that if you don't eat now, you'll be lightheaded by mid-morning and actively hallucinating by noon. Medieval combat training on an empty stomach is not a character-building experience. It's a medical emergency waiting to happen. Someone down the table is gnawing on a heel of cheese so hard it looks like he's trying to eat a stone. Another knight has pulled out a knife and is cutting thin slivers from a piece of dried meat, probably mutton that was smoked months ago, and now has the texture of leather. This is what passes for protein in winter. The fresh meat is reserved for the Lord's table, where you can see them eating something that might actually be recently killed. Your mouth waters watching them, and you hate yourself a little for it. The trencher bread, now thoroughly soaked with pottage, has achieved the consistency of wet cardboard. You eat it anyway, chewing mechanically, tasting salt and rancid fat, and the ghost of whatever herbs the kitchen thought might mask the staleness. Medieval food is not about flavour. It's about calories. It's about putting enough fuel in your body to make it through the next 12 hours of physical demands that would break an Olympic athlete. There's no coffee. Let that sink in. No caffeine whatsoever. Coffee won't reach Europe for another few centuries, and when it does, it'll be expensive enough that only the wealthy can afford it. Right now, your options for waking up are cold water to the face sheer willpower, or the low-grade panic of knowing that if you show weakness, you'll be mocked mercilessly by every other knight in this hall. Medieval masculinity is performative and brutal, and there's no safe space for admitting you're tired or cold, or would really just like to go back to bed. You wash down the last of the trencher with ale, and your stomach gurgles ominously. The combination of stale bread, old stew and sour beer is already staging a revolt in your digestive system. You're going to have impressive flatulence by mid-morning, and so is everyone else in this hall. Medieval dining is a full sensory experience, emphasis on full. Osbert appears at your elbow with your gauntlets. Time to suit back up. Time to face whatever fresh hell the training yard has prepared. You've been awake maybe an hour and you've already eaten something that would make a modern food safety inspector weep with despair. Your stomach makes another threatening sound. The day stretches ahead of you like a sentence. The training yard is a rectangle of packed earth, surrounded by wooden palisades, and it's already occupied by men who look far too energetic for this hour. The sun has barely cleared the castle walls, the air is still sharp with cold, and yet here they are, swinging practice swords, grappling with each other, running through footwork drills with the intensity of people who haven't discovered the concept of a snooze button. You hate them immediately and completely. The training master is a scarred veteran named Sir Godfrey, who lost 3 fingers on his left hand to a Danish axe 20 years ago, and has been making everyone else suffer for it ever since. He spots you emerging from the hall and his face does something that might be a smile if smiles were weaponized. "Late again, are we?" he calls out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Perhaps the armour was too heavy this morning. Perhaps we need to fetch you a nice cushion." The other knights laugh, because they have to social hierarchy means you laugh at your superior's jokes even when they're not funny, especially when they're not funny. You clank across the yard toward the weapon racks, and every step sends little shocks of discomfort through your already aching joints. Sir Godfrey is waiting with a practice sword, a wooden waster that's been used so much the edges are splintered, and the grip is dark with accumulated sweat from 100 different hands. "We begin with cuts," he announces. "High guard to low, 100 repetitions. Begin." You raise the sword above your head. The practice weapon weighs maybe 3 pounds, which doesn't sound like much until you remember you're already wearing 60 pounds of armour, and you just ate a breakfast that's sitting in your stomach like a lead weight. You bring the sword down in a diagonal cut, and Sir Godfrey immediately barks, Again, your weight is all wrong. You're leaning back. Do you want to fall on your ass when a real opponent parries? You reset, raise the sword, cut down. Your shoulder is already burning. This is the first repetition. By the 20th repetition, your arms feel like they're filled with sand. The sword, which started out feeling manageable, now weighs approximately 50 pounds in your perception. Your breathing is getting ragged inside the helmet, and you're starting to understand why some knights fight with their visors up, despite the obvious danger being able to breathe properly is worth the risk of taking an arrow to the face. By the 40th repetition, you're no longer thinking about form or technique. You're just trying to survive. Sweat is running down your face, pooling in your eyebrows, dripping into your eyes and making them sting. You can't wipe it away because you're wearing a helmet. You can't pause because Sir Godfrey is watching, and showing weakness now will only extend the torture. Around you, other knights are going through their own drills, and the air is filled with the rhythmic thunk of wood hitting wood, the grunt of exertion, the occasional curse when someone makes a mistake. By the 60th repetition, you've entered a strange fugue state, where nothing exists except the sword, the motion, and the fire in your shoulders. Your biceps are screaming, your forearms are cramping. The muscles in your upper back feel like they're tearing themselves apart with each movement. And you're only 60% done. Historians often point out that medieval knights trained from childhood boys as young as 7 or 8 began learning swordplay, building the muscle memory and physical conditioning over years. By the time they were dubbed knights in their late teens or early 20s, they had a decade of training behind them. Their bodies were adapted to this. Yours is not. Your modern body, which is used to sitting in chairs and maybe going to the gym twice a week, if you're feeling ambitious, is completely unprepared for the sustained physical brutality of medieval martial training. Some scholars argue that medieval combat training was actually less intense than we imagine, pointing to accounts of knights who are portly or described as enjoying leisure. But these accounts typically refer to older established knights who had earned the right to coast on reputation. Young knights, knights trying to prove themselves, knights who couldn't afford to hire substitutes for tournaments. These men trained constantly brutally because their survival depended on it. At 80 repetitions, your vision is starting to blur. The yard spins slightly every time you lower the sword. Your legs are shaking not from the sword work, but from supporting your armoured body weight through this repetitive motion. At 90, you're not even sure you're doing the drill correctly anymore. You're just moving the sword up and down in some approximation of the pattern, while Sir Godfrey has moved on to tormenting someone else. 100. You lower the sword and immediately want to collapse, but Sir Godfrey is already calling out the next drill. Horizontal cuts, middle guard alternating sides, another 100, and this time try not to move like a pregnant ox. You want to cry. You want to quit. You want to tell Sir Godfrey exactly where he can shove his practice sword. But you don't, because this is only the warm-up. This is the easy part of the day. Later you'll be doing this same drill, but with full contact sparring. Later someone will actually be trying to hit you, and the practice swords will leave bruises that last for weeks. You raise the sword to middle guard and begin cutting left, then right, then left. Your arms feel like overcooked noodles. 20 cuts in and you can barely control the blade. 40 cuts in and the sword is wobbling in your grip. 60 cuts in and you're seriously considering whether a career as a merchant might not have been the better choice. At least merchants get to sleep past dawn. The morning sun is starting to warm the air, which means the interior of your armour is becoming a personal sauna. Sweat is running down your entire body, now soaking into the arming doublet, pooling in uncomfortable places. The padding is going to be disgusting by the end of this session, a sodden, smelly mess that Osbert will have to somehow deal with because you certainly can't wash it. Armour maintenance is constant, and it includes managing the biological reality of a human body sealed inside metal for hours at a time. At 80 repetitions, your grip fails. The sword slips from your hand and clatters to the ground. Sir Godfrey is there instantly, his ruined hand pointing at the weapon. Pick it up. We don't rest until we're done. You bend down, an awkward, painful process in full plate, and retrieve the sword. Your hands are shaking. 15 more cuts. You can do 15 more cuts. You have to do 15 more cuts. 100. The sword drops again, but this time Sir Godfrey nods. Water break, 5 minutes. Then we move to thrusts. 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes to recover before the torture resumes, and you've been training for maybe 30 minutes total. The day has barely begun. You stagger toward the water barrel like a drunk in full plate armor, which is essentially what you are drunk on exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. Someone has left a wooden ladle hooked on the rim, and you grab it with hands that are still trembling from the sword drills. The water is cold and slightly murky, with bits of debris floating on the surface that you're trying very hard not to think about. You lift your visor, finally blessed air hits your face, and pour the water into your mouth. Half of it misses and runs down your chin, soaking into the gorget padding. You don't care. For these 5 minutes, you're just trying to remember how to be human. But even water breaks come with lessons, because medieval knighthood is not just about swinging swords. It's about maintaining an entire social performance, a carefully calibrated identity that must never slip, even when you're bent over a water barrel trying not to vomit from exertion. Sir Godfrey has materialized beside you because apparently he doesn't need water or rest, or any of the biological requirements that plague lesser mortals. You're wondering why we do this, he says, though you weren't wondering anything except whether your arms would ever work normally again. You're thinking I'm a knight. I have land title honour. Why must I stand in a yard and swing a wooden stick like a child? You nod because speaking requires energy you don't have. Because honour, he continues, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a sermon he's delivered 100 times, is not something you possess. It's something you perform, every day, every hour. A knight who cannot fight is not a knight, he's a wealthy man in fancy clothes. And wealth without the ability to defend it, that's just charity waiting to be redistributed. This is the part they don't tell you in the romance tales. Being a knight is essentially a full-time job with no days off, no retirement plan, and a dress code that weighs more than a small child. You're not just a warrior. You're a walking advertisement for your family's status, your lord's power, and the entire feudal system's legitimacy. Every time you appear in public, you're making a statement, I am worth the enormous expense of maintaining me. I justify the peasants who work my land. I validate the social hierarchy that puts me above merchants and craftsmen who actually produce useful things. The economics of knighthood are genuinely insane. Your armour, the full harness you're currently suffocating inside, cost approximately the same as a prosperous peasant family would earn in 3 years. Maybe more if you went for the fancy Milanese plate with the etched designs. Your war horse, the destrier you're supposed to ride into battle, costs enough to buy a small village. You also need regular horses for traveller palfrey, for everyday riding pack horses for your equipment. You need to maintain Osbert and probably another servant or two. You need to keep your weapon sharp, your armour repaired, your clothes appropriate to your station. And where does all this money come from? If you're lucky, you have land and estate granted by your lord that produces income from tenant farmers. But here's the catch, that income is rarely enough to cover your expenses. Most knights live in a state of perpetual near bankruptcy, borrowing money to maintain appearances, hoping that the next tournament will bring prize money, that the next war will bring plunder, that somehow the math will eventually work out. It never does. Some historians estimate that in the 14th century the costs of maintaining knightly status were rising faster than agricultural incomes, creating a class of increasingly desperate minor nobility who were rich in honour and poor in actual money. Sir Godfrey is still talking. Your grandfather fought at Crécy. Did you know that stood in the line when the French cavalry charged? He was your age then, 26 years old, same as you. and when the horses came, thousands of them, the ground shaking the sound like thunder. He didn't run. Do you know why? You shake your head. Because running would have cost him everything. Not just his life, any coward can die, but his name, his family's position, the future of his children and grandchildren. He stood because standing was the only option that allowed his bloodline to continue being worth something. And here you are, his legacy, complaining silently about sword drills. The guilt hits like a physical weight on top of the armor weight. This is another aspect of knightly culture that the modern mind struggles with, the sheer pressure of inherited obligation. You're not just yourself. You're the current manifestation of your family's honour, which stretches backward to your great-great-grandfather, who did something notable enough to earn a title, and forward to children you haven't even had yet. Every action you take either adds to or subtracts from this accumulated capital of reputation. Fail in combat. Your family is shamed. Show cowardice. Your sons will hear about it. Dress poorly. Everyone assumes your estate is failing. Speak too freely with common soldiers. You're undermining the social distinctions that make your position meaningful. The performance never stops. Even when you're alone in your chamber at night, you're supposed to be mentally rehearsing how a proper knight would think, how he would pray, how he would prepare himself for tomorrow's performance. The 5 minutes are up, Sir Godfrey announces. Back to the yard. We're moving to thrust drills, and then we're going to practice entries. That's where you close distance with an opponent and use your body as a weapon. You're going to get hit. You're going to bruise. And you're going to do it with a smile, because knights do not show pain. You want to ask, what if I do show pain? What if I say, this is too much, I need a break, I need a day off? But you already know the answer. There are no days off. There is no opting out. The moment you admit weakness, you begin the slow slide toward irrelevance. Other knights will stop respecting you. Your lord will start questioning whether you're worth your upkeep. Servants will gossip. Eventually you'll be that sad figure every castle has, the knight who's technically still a knight, but who everyone knows is just going through the motions, living on past glory and borrowed time. You lower your visor and walk back to the training yard. Your legs are already sore, your shoulders are on fire. You have maybe 10 hours of this left before you can collapse into bed and start the whole process again tomorrow. Sir Godfrey is grinning, which is never a good sign. He's holding 2 practice daggers. Now we learn how to murder people up close. Pay attention, this part is important. The sun climbs higher, the yard grows warmer, your armour becomes a mobile prison, and the training continues because honour apparently never takes a lunch break. The destrier is not your friend. Let's establish that immediately. The massive warhorse standing in the stable yard is 15 hands high, weighs about 1,200 pounds, and has the temperament of a particularly hostile boulder. His name is Thunder, which you think is melodramatic until you see him kick a wooden fence post hard enough to crack it. Then you understand that Thunder is less a name and more a warning label. Medieval warhorses were not the gentle giants of modern imagination. They were bred for aggression, trained to bite and kick enemy soldiers, conditioned to charge into the chaos of battle without balking. A good destrier was as much a weapon as your sword and just as dangerous to everyone around it, including you. Thunder has already bitten 2 stable boys this month, and he eyes you with the contempt of an animal that knows exactly how much you cost and how poorly you ride. Osbert is holding the reins, standing well to the side because he's been kicked before and learned his lesson. Another servant has brought out your saddle, a massive medieval war saddle with a high cantle and pommel that will essentially lock you in place once you're mounted. This is both a feature and a bug. The high saddle makes it harder to be knocked off during combat, but it also means if you do fall, you're falling from a much greater height while wearing 60 pounds of metal. Knights died from falling off horses during training with depressing regularity. Broken necks, crushed ribs trampled by your own mount as it panicked all standard occupational hazards. "Mount up," Sir Godfrey calls from across the yard where he's already seated on his own horse, looking infuriatingly comfortable. You approach Thunder from the left side because approaching from the right would be incorrect and also might get you bitten. The stirrup is roughly at chest height, which presents an immediate problem. How do you lift your armour-laden leg high enough to reach it? The answer is awkwardly, painfully, and with help. Osbert and another squire essentially lift your left foot into the stirrup while you grab the pommel and haul yourself upward with arm strength you no longer possess after this morning's sword drills. You swing your right leg over a movement that pulls every muscle in your groin and makes you grateful the armour has a fall to protect your dignity, and crash down into the saddle with all the grace of a falling anvil. Thunder shifts beneath you, unimpressed. From up here the world looks different. You're now sitting about 8 feet off the ground, and that's 8 feet you'll be falling from if anything goes wrong. The saddle, despite its padding, is already digging into your thighs. The stirrups are adjustable, but even properly fitted they're going to hurt after an hour of riding. Medieval stirrups were metal, and they transmitted every shock directly into your feet, your ankles, your knees. Long-distance riding in armour wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a form of sustained physical punishment. Sir Godfrey has arranged a series of quintains in the yard, wooden posts with rotating crossbars that have a shield on one end and a weighted sack on the other. The exercise is simple. In theory, you ride at the quinton at speed strike the shield with your lance and avoid getting hit by the weighted sack as the crossbar spins around. In practice, it's an excellent way to get knocked off your horse while your peers laugh at you. Osbert hands up your practice lance. It's 12 feet of solid ash wood with a blunted metal tip, and it weighs about 15 pounds. You're supposed to couch it under your arm, angle it forward, and keep it steady while your horse charges. This requires strength, balance, and coordination. You have none of these things right now. The lance wavers in your grip like a very long, very heavy fishing rod. "First pass," Sir Godfrey shouts. "Walk your horse to the end of the yard, turn Bill to a canter, strike the shield. If you miss, we do it again. If you fall off, we do it again. If the quinton hits you, we laugh and then do it again." You urge Thunder forward with your knees, at least you try to. Medieval horses were trained to respond to leg pressure and weight shifts, but Thunder has already decided you're not worth respecting. He ambles forward at his own pace, taking his time while you attempt to position the lance properly. The weight of it is pulling your arm down. Your shoulder, already damaged from sword drills, is sending distress signals to your brain. This is going to be a disaster. At the end of the yard, you manage to turn Thunder around. This requires pulling on the reins hard enough that your hands hurt, because Thunder does not turn so much as reluctantly agree to face a different direction. Now you're pointed at the quinton, which suddenly looks much smaller and harder to hit than it did from the ground. You dig your heels into Thunder's flanks and he breaks into a trot, then a canter. The world begins to bounce violently. Riding in armour is nothing like riding in normal clothes. Every movement of the horse is amplified through the rigid structure of your harness. Your body can't absorb the shock naturally because the metal won't flex. Instead, you're being rattled like dice in a cup, your spine compressing with each stride, your teeth clacking together inside the helmet. The lance is bouncing everywhere. You're trying to aim it at the shield, but the shield is moving, or you're moving, or everything is moving, and nothing is where it should be. You strike the quintain with the lance, but you've hit it at completely the wrong angle. The lance glances off, nearly flies out of your grip, and the crossbar spins lazily. The weighted sack swings around and catches you in the shoulder with a solid thunk that you feel even through the pauldron. Thunder, startled by the impact, sidesteps violently. You lean too far left to compensate, and suddenly the world tilts. You're falling. Time does that strange thing where it slows down and speeds up simultaneously. You can see the ground approaching, can see the packed earth that's going to hurt tremendously when you hit it, can hear someone shouting, probably Osbert, and then impact. You land on your side and the armor distributes the force across your entire torso, which means instead of breaking one rib, you just get comprehensively bruised everywhere at once. The breath leaves your lungs. Dust fills your visor. Thunder prances away looking vaguely satisfied. From the ground you hear slow clapping. Sir Godfrey has ridden over and is applauding your failure. Excellent, you've demonstrated exactly how not to do it. Everyone gather round and observe our friend here. This is what happens when you forget that the lance is not a club, when you strike without your body behind the blow, when you let the horse control you instead of controlling the horse. You're still on the ground, struggling to breathe, and he's using you as an object lesson. This is peak medieval pedagogy. Get up, he commands. We're doing it again and again and again until you get it right, or until we run out of daylight, whichever comes first. Osbert and 2 other squires help haul you to your feet. Everything hurts. New places hurt that didn't hurt before. You're pretty sure you landed on a rock. Thunder is waiting, still looking smug. The Quinton stands ready for round 2. You've been training for maybe 3 hours. The day is far from over. The bells ring for sext midday prayers, and you've never been more grateful for mandatory religious observance in your life. Sir Godfrey finally calls a halt to the mounted combat torture, and you slide off Thunder with all the elegance of a sack of potatoes falling off a cart. Your legs buckle when you hit the ground. Osbert catches your arm before you face plant into the dirt, and you're too tired to be embarrassed about it. The chapel is mercifully dim and cool after the blazing training yard. You clank down the aisle behind the other knights, your armour announcing every step with metallic echoes that bounce off the stone walls. The priest, a thin man with a disapproving face that looks like he's been smelling spoiled milk for 40 years, watches your noisy entrance with barely concealed irritation. Armour in chapel is technically acceptable, but only if you're about to ride to war. For daily prayers, it's considered somewhat gauche, like wearing muddy boots into someone's dining hall. But removing the armour takes 40 minutes you don't have, so here you stand, a sweaty, bruised, clanking disaster attempting to look pious. You lower yourself onto the stone bench with a symphony of creaks and groans, some from the armour, some from your body. Around you, other knights are doing the same, a chorus of exhausted men trying to remember how to kneel without toppling over. The priest begins the Latin prayers, his voice echoing through the vaulted space. You're supposed to know these prayers by heart, supposed to respond at the appropriate moments, supposed to demonstrate that you're not just a killer in metal, but a Christian knight devoted to God and righteousness. The reality is that after 3 hours of brutal physical training, you can barely remember your own name, much less the correct Latin responses to the liturgy. Your stomach growls a sound that echoes impressively inside your helmet. You haven't eaten since that dismal breakfast 4 hours ago, and your body is screaming for fuel. Medieval meal schedules were irregular at best, dictated by religious observances, available daylight, and the Lord's whims. The main meal of the day won't be served until early afternoon, which means you've got at least another hour of starvation to look forward to. The chapel smells like old incense and newer sweat. Dozens of men crammed into a stone room, many of them in armour or heavy clothing, all of them breathing the same recycled air. Someone near you is clearly suffering from gastrointestinal distress. Those breakfast rations are taking their revenge. You try breathing through your mouth, but that just means you're tasting what you'd rather not smell. The priest is droning on about virtue and sacrifice, about how knights are God's warriors, about how suffering in this life leads to glory in the next. It's a nice theory, but right now you'd trade a significant portion of your afterlife for a soft chair and a sandwich. Your knees are digging into the stone floor through the armour's articulated leg plates. Your back is screaming from holding yourself upright in 60 pounds of metal. Your head is pounding from dehydration and too much sun. This is the part nobody tells you about how much of being a knight is just endurance. Not the dramatic endurance of withstanding a siege or fighting for hours in battle, but the grinding daily endurance of simply existing inside your identity. The endless performance of strength, the constant maintenance of equipment and reputation, the pressure to never complain, never falter, never admit that you're hungry or tired, or would really just like to sleep for a week. Historians still argue about how genuinely religious medieval knights actually were. Some point to the elaborate devotions, the prayers before combat, the shrines and relics that soldiers carried as evidence of deep faith. Others suggest much of it was social performance. You prayed because everyone prayed you went to chapel, because not going meant questions about your character. Either way, the chapel was a break from training, and that alone made it sacred. The prayers finally end. The priest gives a blessing that sounds more like a threat, something about God watching for weakness and finding it wanting. You struggle to your feet, joints popping audibly, and shuffle toward the door with the other knights. Daylight hits your visor like a slap. The yard's waiting. So is Sir Godfrey, who apparently doesn't believe in lunch breaks. But first, miraculously, food. Servants have set up trestle tables under an awning, and they're ladling out something that might charitably be called stew. You grab a bowl and a hunk of bread, remove your gauntlets, and eat standing up, because sitting down and then getting back up again requires more energy than you currently possess. The stew tastes like water seasoned with regret. There might be vegetables in here. There might be meat. Mostly there's just brown liquid and the overwhelming flavour of salt, because salt is cheap and flavour is expensive. You eat it anyway, mechanically fueling the machine that is your body. Around you, other knights are doing the same, all of them silent, all of them calculating how much energy they have left for the afternoon session. Osbert appears with your gauntlets. Time's up. Sir Godfrey is already calling everyone back to the yard. The afternoon training is about to begin, and from the wicked smile on his face, it's going to make the morning look like a pleasant warm-up. You drain the last of your ale, wipe your mouth with the back of your hand, and prepare to suffer some more. Being a knight is glorious, they said. You'll be honoured and respected, they said. They never mentioned you'd spend most of your time just trying not to collapse. The Great Hall in the afternoon is a different beast than the Great Hall at breakfast. For one thing, there are now approximately 60 people crammed into a space designed for maybe 40, and every single one of them wants something. The Lord sits on the dais at the far end looking bored and irritated in equal measure while petitioners approach one by one to air their grievances, make requests, or simply remind him that they exist and deserve consideration. You're standing against the wall with the other household knights, and standing is doing a lot of heavy lifting as a verb here. You're essentially propping yourself up through sheer willpower while trying to look alert and dangerous. This is your job for the next 2 hours. Be a visible symbol of your Lord's power. Don't move, don't sit, don't yawn. Just stand there in full armour, looking like you could spring into action at any moment, even though you can barely feel your feet anymore. The petitioners are a parade of human misery and ambition. A merchant is arguing about toll fees on the bridge. A peasant is complaining that his neighbour's pigs keep destroying his garden. 2 farmers are disputing the boundary line between their fields. A minor nobleman from a neighbouring estate has arrived to discuss a potential marriage alliance. Everyone speaks in the elaborate flowery language of medieval diplomacy, which means a simple, "your pigs are annoying" becomes a 10-minute speech about honour tradition and the natural order of things. Your lord listens with the expression of a man who would rather be literally anywhere else. He's maybe 45, which makes him ancient by medieval standards, and you can see the toll of decades of this tedium written in the lines around his eyes. He interrupts the pig dispute to render a judgment that satisfies no one, which is apparently the definition of successful mediation in feudal law. Here's what nobody tells you about knightly service, so much of it is just standing around being decorative. You're not fighting battles every day. You're not rescuing maidens or slaying dragons. You're standing in drafty halls while bureaucracy happens at the speed of ox cart. Medieval governance was intensely personal and face-to-face, which meant every dispute, every decision, every negotiation required physical presence and public performance. And you as a household knight are part of that performance. You represent violence held in check power that could be unleashed if the Lord desires it. Your job is to loom menacingly while wearing very expensive metal, thereby reminding everyone that challenging the Lord's authority has physical consequences. It's psychological warfare by interior decoration. Your legs are cramping. The armour which briefly felt bearable after lunch is now a prison again. Sweat is running down your back, pooling at the base of your spine, where the cuirass meets the fold. Your feet are screaming inside the sabatons because metal shoes were never designed for prolonged standing. You try shifting your weight from foot to foot without being obvious about it, but the armour makes subtlety impossible. Every tiny movement announces itself with squeaks and clinks. The merchant is now arguing about grain prices. The Lord looks like he's contemplating whether jumping out the window would be preferable to hearing another word about wheat. One of his advisers, a clerk with ink-stained fingers and the hunched shoulders of someone who spends his life bent over ledgers, is whispering calculations in his ear. Numbers are being discussed. Percentages. Yields. Your eyes glaze over. This is the reality of feudal economics. Everything is negotiated, nothing is standardized, and every transaction involves personal relationships that stretch back generations. The merchant isn't just selling grain. He's reminding the Lord that his family has served this estate for 3 generations, that his grandfather once lent money during a bad harvest. That loyalty should count for something in the pricing structure. Medieval business was nepotism with accounting. A dog wanders through the hall, stops to scratch itself vigorously, then pisses on the rushes covering the floor. No one reacts. This is normal. The rushes are changed maybe once a month, and until then they serve as a combination carpet insulation and communal toilet for the castle's animal population. The smell is remarkable, a blend of dog urine, spilled beer, old food, and the accumulated funk of 60 human bodies in various states of cleanliness. Your stomach is rumbling again despite the stew. Medieval digestion was rapid, because medieval diets were mostly fibre and air with occasional visits from protein. That midday stew has already processed through your system, and your body is demanding more fuel, but there won't be more food until the evening meal, which is still hours away. You're going to spend the rest of the afternoon running on fumes and righteous indignation. The marriage negotiation is happening now. The visiting nobleman is describing his daughter in terms usually reserved for livestock breeding. She's healthy, fertile, has all her teeth, comes with a decent dowry, and apparently has a pleasant disposition, which probably means she's been beaten into submission by 16 years of medieval parenting. The Lord nods along, pretending to care while clearly calculating whether this alliance is worth the expense of hosting a wedding feast. You've been standing for 90 minutes. Your lower back is spasming. Your shoulders feel like someone is driving nails through them. You can't feel your toes anymore, which is probably a mercy. Around you, the other household knights are suffering in identical silence. All of you bound by the unspoken code that says showing weakness is worse than actual death. Finally, the Lord stands, signalling the end of the afternoon's proceedings. Everyone bows. Everyone makes elaborate speeches about gratitude and honour. Everyone files out slowly because rushing would be undignified. You remain standing because you're not dismissed yet. The Lord catches your eye and gives a tiny nod. Now you can go. You turn to leave and your knees nearly give out. Osbert materializes to steady you, and together you clank out of the hall into the late afternoon light. The training yard beckons again. Because of course it does. Let's talk about money, because this is where the romantic fantasy of knighthood crashes into the brick wall of medieval economics. You're standing in your chamber, finally given a brief respite before evening training, while Osbert helps you out of the armour. Each piece he removes reveals new bruises, new chafe marks, new evidence that your body is not designed for this life. And as he carefully sets each piece aside, you're mentally calculating what it cost and what it's costing you to maintain it. The full harness you've been wearing all day, approximately £300 sterling. That's roughly what a skilled craftsman would earn in 3 years of labour. Your helmet alone costs more than a peasant family's annual income. The cuirass required a master armourer working for weeks, shaping and fitting the steel to your specific measurements, because armour that doesn't fit properly will kill you just as surely as having no armour at all. But that's just the initial purchase. Now comes the maintenance. Steel rusts, especially when you've been sweating in it for 12 hours. Every night the armour needs to be cleaned, oiled, checked for damage. Leather straps dry out and crack. Buckles break. Rivets loosen. You're essentially maintaining a very expensive, very high-maintenance machine, and that machine is the only thing standing between you and a sword in the belly. Osbert is already at work with an oiled rag wiping down the cuirass, checking for spots where rust might be forming. He finds a small dent in the left pauldron, probably from when you fell off Thunder this morning, and makes a note to take it to the castle armourer for repair. That repair will cost money. Everything costs money. Your sword, a proper battle sword. Not the practice waster you've been swinging all day, sits in its scabbard by your bed. It costs £20 sterling, which is approximately 4 months of a knight's typical income. It needs regular sharpening, which costs money. The scabbard needs maintenance. The grip needs re-wrapping when it wears out. The pommel, crossguard and blade all need periodic inspection by a weaponsmith who charges fees that make you wince. Then there's Thunder. Your destrier cost more than everything else combined, maybe £60 sterling if you got a good deal. But owning a warhorse is like owning a very expensive, very temperamental car that eats constantly and occasionally tries to kill you. Thunder needs to be fed, and not just any feed warhorses require quality grain hay and supplements to maintain their strength. He needs to be reshod regularly by a farrier who charges premium rates, because shoeing a warhorse is dangerous work. He needs veterinary care when he's sick or injured, and medieval horse medicine was expensive quackery that sometimes worked. You also need regular riding horses for travel, because you don't ride your destrier everywhere that would wear him out and reduce his combat effectiveness. So add 2 or 3 palfreys to your stable, each requiring their own feed and maintenance. The stable rent at the castle costs you annually. The grooms who care for the horses expect payment and tips. Osbert himself is an expense. Yes, he's working for you in exchange for training and the eventual promise of knighthood, but you're still supposed to provide his food, clothing, equipment, and a small allowance. When he inevitably breaks something or needs new clothes or wants to visit his family, that's coming out of your pocket. Your clothing is another drain. You can't just wear anything. You're expected to dress according to your station, which means expensive wool, fine linen, decent leather shoes. Your surcoat, the fabric garment you wear over your armour, displaying your heraldry, needs to be maintained and replaced when it wears out. Fabric in medieval times was expensive, because every thread was hand-spun, every piece hand-woven. A single good wool tunic could cost £50 sterling. And here's the real problem. Where does all this money come from? If you're extremely lucky, you have an estate that generates rental income from tenant farmers. But that income is seasonal, dependent on harvest quality, and rarely sufficient to cover your expenses. Most knights lived in a state of genteel poverty, constantly borrowing money to maintain appearances, hoping that tournament prizes or war plunder would eventually balance the books. Tournaments offered prize money, yes, but they also required entry fees, travel expenses, and the very real risk of destroying expensive equipment. If you break a lance in the joust, you need to buy a new one, £3 or £4 sterling each. If your armour gets damaged, repairs cost money. If your horse gets injured, you might need to buy a new one, plunging you instantly into catastrophic debt. Wars offered the possibility of plunder and ransom, but they also meant months away from your estate, which meant lost income and management problems. And if you were captured yourself, your family would need to raise a ransom that could financially destroy them for generations. Some knights solved this problem by becoming essentially hired thugs, offering their military services to anyone who could pay. Others married wealthy widows or heiresses, trading their military skills and social status for access to money. Still others simply went bankrupt, lost their estates, and faded into obscurity. Former knights working as men-at-arms or mercenaries, their armour pawned, their horses sold, their heraldry meaningless. Historians estimate that by the late medieval period, maintaining knightly status required an annual income of about £40 sterling minimum, but many knights were living on £15 or £20. The math simply didn't work. The entire institution was slowly collapsing under its own financial weight, with knights increasingly unable to afford being knights. Osbert has finished with the armour, and is now laying out your evening clothes slightly less elaborate than what you wore to the hall earlier, but still expensive wool and linen that represents another chunk of money you don't really have. You're expected at dinner in an hour where you'll sit and eat and smile and pretend that you're not one bad harvest or broken leg away from financial ruin. This is the secret they don't tell you. Being a knight means living on the edge of bankruptcy while performing wealth you don't possess. It's all borrowed glory on credit you can't repay. The afternoon training session is full contact sparring, which is a polite way of saying, we're going to beat each other senseless with blunt weapons while calling it practice. You're back in the yard, back in full armour that Osbert has hastily reassembled on your bruised body, and Sir Godfrey is pairing people off with the enthusiasm of someone organising a particularly violent wedding reception. You, he says, pointing at you, with Sir Ralph. First to 3 touches or until someone yields. No maiming, no killing, everything else is fair. Sir Ralph is a boulder of a man, maybe 35 years old, with a face that looks like it's been hit with every blunt object in Christendom. He's been doing this since he was 7. You've been doing it since this morning. This seems like a fair match-up in the same way that a rabbit fighting a wolf is technically both animals engaging in combat. You take your practice sword, blunted steel that still weighs £3, and move to the centre of the sparring ring. Sir Ralph is already there, bouncing slightly on his feet despite wearing full armour, which seems physically impossible, but here we are. He gives you a gap-toothed grin that promises pain. Sir Godfrey raises his hand. Begin! Ralph comes at you immediately, no hesitation, his sword coming in a diagonal cut aimed at your shoulder. You manage to raise your own blade to parry, and the impact travels up your arms like lightning. The swords clash with a metallic crack that echoes across the yard. Your previous sword drills did absolutely nothing to prepare you for the violence of actual contact. This isn't about form anymore, it's about survival. You try to riposte a quick thrust toward his chest, but Ralph has already moved. He sidesteps, his armour moving with surprising fluidity, and brings his sword around in a horizontal cut that catches you in the ribs. Even through the cuirass you feel it. The breath leaves your lungs. That's one touch. Point, Sir Godfrey calls. Reset. You stagger back to your starting position, gasping inside your helmet. Ralph looks completely unbothered, like he's taking a leisurely walk, rather than fighting in 60 pounds of steel. This is what decades of training creates, a body so adapted to armour that it moves naturally, a mind so accustomed to violence that combat becomes meditation. Begin! This time you try to be more defensive, keeping your sword between you and Ralph, watching for his next attack. He circles left and you turn to track him, your feet shuffling in the dirt. Then he feints high, your sword goes up to block and he drops low, slamming his blade into your thigh. The pollens protect you from serious injury, but the impact still feels like someone hit you with a hammer. Point 20. Final point determines the match. Your leg is throbbing, your ribs ache, you're breathing hard, and the inside of your helmet is fogged with condensation from your breath. Sweat is running into your eyes again, stinging, blurring your vision. Ralph is still bouncing, still grinning, clearly enjoying himself. Medieval combat training wasn't gentle. Knights regularly broke bones in practice, suffered concussions, dislocated joints. Training accidents killed people with grim regularity, a practice sword to the wrong spot, a fall onto rocks, a heart attack from exhaustion. But the alternative was going into real combat unprepared, which meant certain death. So you trained hard and hoped you survived long enough to make the investment worthwhile. Begin. You decide to attack this time, charging forward with your sword raised. Hoping momentum will compensate for skill, it doesn't. Ralph simply steps aside like a matador, avoiding a bull, and as you stumble past him, he slaps you across the back with the flat of his blade. Not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to make the point you're completely outmatched. Point match to Sir Ralph. Next pairing. You stand there in the centre of the ring, defeated, humiliated, and in pain. Around you, other matches are happening. The clash of steel, the grunts of effort, the occasional cry when someone takes a particularly solid hit. This is the daily reality of nightly training-controlled violence that prepares you for uncontrolled violence. You're learning through pain, adapting through injury, becoming harder, because hardness is the only alternative to death. Osbert brings you water and you lift your visor to drink. Your hands are shaking. Not from fear, though there's certainly some of that, but from sheer muscular fatigue. You've been gripping weapons, shields and reins all day, and your forearms feel like they're filled with broken glass. You're tensing up, Sir Godfrey says, appearing beside you. Fighting scared. Your shoulders are up around your ears, your grip is too tight, you're not breathing properly. All of that makes you slow, predictable, easy to beat. You want to say I'm tensing up because a large man just hit me 3 times with a metal stick, but you don't because complaining is weakness. Watch Sir Ralph, Godfrey continues. See how he's relaxed between exchanges. That's years of training. His body knows what to do, so his mind can focus on strategy. You're still thinking about every movement, which means you're always one step behind. The only cure is repetition. More sparring, more bruises, more failure, until eventually your body remembers what your mind can't process fast enough. It's the most encouraging thing he's said all day, and it still sounds like a threat. Rest for 5 minutes, then you're up again. This time against Sir Malcolm. He's left-handed, so everything you've learned is now backwards. Have fun. 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes before you're beaten up again by someone whose entire fighting style will confuse your already overwhelmed brain. You sit on a bench carefully, because sitting in armour is its own challenge, and try to remember why you thought becoming a knight was a good idea. The answer escapes you entirely. Osbert is 14 years old, exhausted, and currently has his hand stuck inside your left sabaton trying to unbuckle a strap that's somehow gotten twisted during the sparring session. His face is red with effort, and you can hear him muttering under his breath. Probably curses, though he's trying to keep them quiet enough that you can't quite make out the words. You don't blame him. If you were 14 and responsible for maintaining a full-grown man in 60 pounds of temperamental metal, you'd be cursing too. It's stuck, he finally says, looking up at you with the kind of desperation that comes from knowing he's going to be blamed for this. The buckle's bent. Must have happened when Sir Malcolm kicked you. Ah, yes. Sir Malcolm, the left-handed knight who systematically dismantled you during the second sparring match. The one who kicked your leg out from under you, sending you crashing to the ground where you laid like an overturned turtle until 2 squires helped you up. That's Sir Malcolm, The bent buckle is the least of the injuries from that encounter. "Can you fix it?" you ask, trying to keep the irritation out of your voice. Osbert is not the enemy here. Osbert is the only thing standing between you and complete equipment failure. "I can try," he says, pulling out a small knife and attempting to pry the buckle open. His hands are shaking slightly from exhaustion, or fear of damaging expensive equipment you're not sure, maybe both. Squires lived in a constant state of anxiety about breaking things they couldn't afford to replace. One serious mistake could end their path to knighthood before it began. While he works, you take the opportunity to actually look at him. Really look. His face is smudged with dirt and what might be oil from the armour cleaning. His tunic, which was probably decent quality when his family gave it to him, is now torn at the shoulder and stained beyond repair. His fingernails are cracked and blackened. There are bruises on his arms from carrying heavy equipment and a burn scar on his left hand from getting too close to the forge while waiting for armour repairs. This is his life. Wake before dawn, dress an armour knight who probably doesn't appreciate him, spend the day running errands and maintaining equipment. Eat whatever scraps are left over from your meals, sleep on a pallet in a drafty corridor and repeat until either he's promoted to knight himself or he breaks completely and runs away. The squire system was essentially child labour with aristocratic branding. "Got it," Osbert says, finally working the buckle free. He pulls the sabaton off your foot and the relief is immediate and profound. Your foot, which has been compressed inside metal for approximately 10 hours, expands gratefully. You can see the red pressure marks where the armour has been digging into your skin. Osbert moves to the other foot, working more carefully now. "How long have you been my squire?" you ask, suddenly realising you've never actually had this conversation. 8 months, he says without looking up. "Since Martin got promoted and went to serve the Lord's nephew. Make guess. 8 months. You've spent 8 months with this boy attending to your every need, and you barely know anything about him except that he's competent and rarely complains. That seems like a failure on your part." "Where's your family?" "Devon. Father's a knight, serves Baron Ashford. Sent me here because Lord William has a better reputation for training squires. He's got the second sabaton off now and is moving to the Greaves. 4 more years if I'm lucky, then maybe I get knighted, if I don't die first." The casual way he mentions death is jarring until you remember that medieval mortality was constant background noise. Osbert has probably already lost siblings to disease, seen friends die from training accidents, watched people succumb to infections from minor wounds. Death wasn't a distant possibility, it was a neighbour you nodded to daily. "You ever regret it?" you ask. "Choosing this path?" He pauses, considers the question seriously. "Every day," he finally says. "But what else is there? Go home and farm, become a priest. At least this way I might end up being someone." He returns to unbuckling your leg armour, his hands moving with practiced efficiency now. "Besides, if I quit, Father would kill me anyway, so might as well die trying to become a knight." He's joking. Probably. The line between joke and truth was thin in medieval families, where honour and expectations could be suffocating. The armour is coming off piece by piece, and with each removal you feel lighter and simultaneously more aware of how much everything hurts. Without the metal shell, all your bruises announce themselves. Your shoulder throbs where Ralph hit you. Your ribs ache with each breath. Your thigh has a spectacular bruise forming where Malcolm's practice sword found a gap in the plates. Your neck feels like it's been compressed by about 2 inches. Osbert is examining the armour as he removes it, checking for damage, making mental notes about what needs repair. The dent in the pauldron from this morning's fall. The bent buckle on the sabaton. A scratch on the cuirass that's gone through the paint and exposed bare metal that needs immediate attention before rust sets in. A loose rivet on the left euter. The gorget's padding is coming loose and needs to be re-sewn. "I'll take these down to the armourer after dinner," he says. "Get them fixed tonight so they're ready tomorrow." Which means Osbert will be working late into the evening while you're at dinner, then sleeping maybe 4 hours before starting the whole process again tomorrow. "You should eat first," you say. He looks at you surprised, like the concept of his needs being considered is novel. "I'll eat after. Armour first." "Osbert, eat first. The armour can wait an hour." He nods slowly, still looking uncertain, like this might be a trap. You realise that in 8 months you've probably never once explicitly told him to take care of himself before taking care of your equipment. That's another failure to add to the growing list. The cuirass comes off last and you can finally breathe properly. The arming doublet underneath is soaked with sweat clinging to your body. You smell like a stable. Osbert diplomatically doesn't mention it. "Go," you tell him. "Eat. Rest. The armour will still be broken in an hour." He hesitates, then nods and leaves, taking your armour with him piece by piece. You sit on your bed in your sweat-soaked underclothes and realise that Osbert's day is longer than yours, his work harder, his rewards more distant. And he's just a kid. The bells ring for vespers. Dinner soon. Another performance awaits. You can't read very well. Let's just acknowledge that uncomfortable truth right now. You can recognise maybe 100 words by sight, can slowly puzzle through simple Latin. If someone gives you an hour and tremendous patience, and can sign your name with the shaky confidence of someone who learned the shapes of the letters without fully understanding what they mean. This is not unusual for a knight. Some scholars estimate that even in the late medieval period, only about 30% of nobility could read fluently, and far fewer could write with any real skill. But here's the problem: you have correspondence to manage. Because you're not just a warrior, you're also an administrator, a landlord, a participant in the complex web of feudal obligations that requires documentation. And right now, sitting on the small table in your chamber, is a letter from your estate manager detailing problems with the harvest disputes between tenants and urgent questions about resource allocation that you're supposed to answer. The letter is in Latin. Of course it is. The lingua franca of medieval administration. The language of law and learning and making yourself feel stupid when you can barely make it through a sentence. You hold the parchment up to the fading afternoon light and squint at the cramped handwriting. The clerk who wrote this clearly values economy of parchment over legibility. The letters are tiny, squeezed together with abbreviations that you're supposed to recognise but don't. You make out, "Dominus, Lord, that's you." Something about frumentum grain wheat viginti 20-something. 20 what bushels, pounds, peasants. The sentence structure is twisted into the complex subordinate clauses that Latin loves and your brain hates. By the time you reach the end of a sentence, you've forgotten what the beginning said. This is humiliating. You're supposedly a member of the noble class, a person of authority and education, and you're sitting here moving your lips while sounding out words like a child. If anyone saw you right now, really saw you struggling with basic literacy, it would undermine everything. Knights are supposed to be skilled in letters and law as well as warfare. The chivalric ideal includes education. You're failing at half your job. The estate manager is waiting for a response. Decisions need to be made about the harvest, about settling the tenant disputes, about allocating resources for winter. These are important matters that affect real people's lives and your own income, and you can't understand the letter well enough to make informed choices. You could ask for help. The castle has clerks, educated men who spend their days writing letters and keeping accounts and managing the bureaucratic machinery of feudal life. But asking for help means admitting weakness, means revealing that you're not the competent lord your tenants need you to be. Pride and necessity war in your chest, and pride is winning even though it shouldn't. So you do what many semi-literate nobles did: you fake it. You'll write a response that's vague enough to sound authoritative while avoiding specific commitments you might regret. Something about using your best judgment and proceeding as tradition dictates, and keeping me informed of developments. Meaningless administrative language that shifts responsibility back to the estate manager while maintaining the fiction that you're in control. But first, you have to actually write the response, which presents its own challenges. Your handwriting is atrocious. The quill feels wrong in your hand, too light, too delicate, prone to splattering ink when you press too hard. Your fingers calloused from sword grips and reins are not designed for the fine motor control that writing requires. The letters come out uneven, some too large, some too small, wandering drunkenly across the parchment with complete disregard for straight lines. You make 3 false starts, wasting precious parchment each time before you get something that looks approximately like written language. The Latin is almost certainly wrong, you're guessing at grammar, hoping that the estate manager will be charitable in his interpretation. You sign your name at the bottom with a flourish that is meant to convey confidence, but probably just looks like a dying spider made one last dramatic gesture. Medieval administration was full of people like you nobles, who governed by authority of birth rather than competence making decisions about complex matters. They barely understood, relying on educated subordinates to translate their vague instructions into actual policy. Some historians argue this system worked better than it should have because the clerks and estate managers were genuinely skilled and could read between the lines of their lord's ignorant commands. Others point out that this is exactly why medieval governance was so often chaotic and inefficient. You seal the letter with wax and your signet ring, at least that part you can do properly, and set it aside for a messenger. Then you look at the other documents on your table, an invitation to a tournament 3 weeks from now which you should probably accept but can't afford, a letter from your mother asking about your marriage prospects with barely concealed desperation, a notice from the king's tax collector that you've been trying to ignore but probably can't avoid much longer. Each document represents a decision you need to make, a response you need to write, a level of literacy and administrative competence you don't quite possess. And there's no one you can admit this to without destroying your reputation. Knights are supposed to be educated, lords are supposed to be competent. The gap between expectation and reality is a chasm you're trying to bridge with bluster and hope. You hear voices outside, servants preparing for the evening meal. Soon you'll need to go down to the hall, take your place, perform lordship and knighthood for another few hours. But right now, alone in your chamber with these incomprehensible letters, you feel like an imposter wearing borrowed authority. The quill sits on the table mocking you with its simplicity. Such a small tool, yet it might as well be a weapon you don't know how to wield. You're a knight. You can fight, ride, and endure. But manage your own affairs through written correspondence that's apparently beyond your considerable training. Tomorrow you'll have to face the training yard again. But tonight these letters feel like a more intimidating opponent than Sir Ralph or Sir Malcolm ever were. The evening feast is theatre, and you're an actor who's forgotten half his lines. The great hall has been transformed since the afternoon's administrative tedium. Trestle tables arranged in careful hierarchy, candles and torches, providing flickering light servants rushing between the kitchen and the tables with platters of food that actually smell decent for once. The lord sits on the dais with his family and honoured guests, and you're positioned at a table in the middle distance, close enough to matter, but far enough to know your place. The meal begins with a parade of dishes that would be impressive if you weren't so exhausted you could barely taste anything. There's roasted meat, possibly venison, possibly mutton, definitely overcooked, and swimming in a sauce designed to mask the fact that it was killed 3 days ago. There's a pottage that's better than breakfast but still fundamentally pottage. There's bread that's actually fresh and soft, a luxury reserved for dinner. There's wine instead of ale, which means someone important is visiting and the lord is showing off. But eating is only a small part of what you're here to do. The real work is navigating the intricate social performance that is medieval dining. You're supposed to know who to speak to, who to ignore, what topics are safe, what jokes are acceptable. You're supposed to eat with proper etiquette. No elbows on the table, no grabbing food with your hands. Unless it's specifically meant to be finger food, no wiping your mouth on your sleeve, even though there's literally nothing else to wipe it on except the tablecloth, which is also forbidden. The man sitting next to you is Sir Hugh, an older knight who's been with the household for 20 years and has opinions about everything. He's currently holding forth on the declining quality of young squires, while simultaneously eating with his mouth open, spraying bits of bread as he talks. You nod along, making appropriate noises of agreement while internally calculating how much longer you have to sit here before you can escape. Across the table is Lady Eleanor, the Lord's niece, who's visiting while her husband is away on some business that's probably more interesting than this dinner. She's maybe 25, sharp-eyed and clearly bored, and she's watching the room with the expression of someone cataloguing everyone's failures for a later mockery. When she catches you looking, she raises one eyebrow, in a gesture that could mean anything from "can you believe this" to "stop staring at me before I have you thrown out." Medieval dining was aggressively communal. Privacy didn't exist. Conversation was public performance. Everything you said could and would be repeated, embellished, and used against you in the complex social games that occupied the nobility when they weren't fighting wars. A careless word at dinner could spark feuds that lasted generations. A minstrel has started playing in the corner some ballad about a knight who rescued a maiden from a dragon. The melody is pleasant enough, but the lyrics are painfully idealized. The knight in the song doesn't spend his days getting beaten up in training yards or struggling to read correspondence. He doesn't have hemorrhoids from riding or persistent coughs from sleeping in drafty rooms. He's perfect, brave, courteous, and entirely fictional. Sir Hugh is now complaining about taxes, the king's latest demand for funding some war or expedition or building project, and how it's bleeding the nobility dry. "We're supposed to maintain our households, our equipment, our honour," he says, gesturing with a chicken leg for emphasis. And every year he wants more. How are we supposed to manage? This is dangerous territory. Criticising the king too openly is treason, but not criticising him enough makes you seem like a bootlicker. You make a non-committal sound and take a long drink of wine, which is both a socially acceptable pause and also helps with the pain that's radiating from every muscle in your body. Lady Eleanor leans forward. Perhaps if knights didn't spend quite so much on tournaments and fancy armour, they'd have more for taxes. Her voice is light teasing, but there's an edge to it. She's testing you, seeing how you respond to criticism. Perhaps if ladies didn't spend quite so much on elaborate headdresses and silk gowns, their husbands could afford better armour. You reply, keeping your tone equally light, playing the game. She smiles a real smile this time, not the performative court smile. Touché. Though I'd point out that my headdress costs significantly less than your horse, and doesn't try to bite people. Sir Hugh laughs, spraying more bread. Other people at the table are listening now, enjoying the verbal sparring. This is entertainment in a world without television or internet, watching people insult each other with elaborate courtesy. The servers bring out another course, some kind of fish in aspic, that wobbles alarmingly on the platter. Medieval food presentation aimed for spectacle over practicality. The fish has been decorated to look like it's still swimming, complete with carved vegetables as plants. It's impressive craftsmanship wasted on something that's going to taste like fishy gelatin. You take a portion because refusing would be rude. The aspic is exactly as unpleasant as anticipated, cold, slippery, vaguely fish-flavoured. You swallow it quickly and reach for more bread to cleanse your palate. The dinner drags on. 4 hours, maybe 5. Course after course appears, each requiring appropriate appreciation and consumption. Your stomach, which was desperately hungry 2 hours ago, is now uncomfortably full and protesting the combination of meat, bread, wine, and aspic. Medieval digestion was constant warfare between hunger and indigestion. Finally, mercifully, the Lord stands signalling the meal's end. Everyone rises, makes their bows, and begins filtering out of the hall. You escape into the night air, which is cold and sharp and absolutely glorious after hours in the smoky, crowded hall. Your head is swimming slightly from the wine. Your body is screaming from the day's accumulated abuse. Osbert is waiting in your chamber, having returned from the armourer with your repaired equipment. He looks dead on his feet, but he's already laying out your nightclothes, preparing the chamber for sleep. He doesn't complain, doesn't ask how your dinner was, just performs his duties with mechanical efficiency. Tomorrow begins again in a few hours. The tournament summons arrived 3 days ago, and it's been sitting on your table like an unexploded bomb ever since. Lord Pembroke is hosting 2 weeks' travel from here, with substantial prize money for the winners, and more importantly the kind of social prestige that comes from being seen at a major event. This is the sort of invitation you can't easily refuse without people questioning whether you're actually a serious knight or just someone playing dress-up in expensive metal. But here's the problem, and it's a problem that keeps you awake at night: tournaments are financial suicide dressed up as entertainment. Let's do the math. The kind of math that makes your barely literate brain hurt even more than Latin grammar. First, travel. 2 weeks to get there. 2 weeks back, that's a month away from your estate. A month of lost income, lost oversight, lost control. You'll need to bring Osbert, obviously, plus at least 2 other servants to manage the horses and equipment. That's 4 people eating and sleeping at inns along the way, at maybe 2 pence per person per day. Already you're looking at several pounds sterling just in travel expenses before you even arrive at the tournament grounds. Then there's equipment. You'll need fresh lances, multiple fresh lances, because you'll break them. That's the point of jousting. Each lance costs £3 to £4 sterling. You need at least 6, maybe 10 if you're planning to compete in multiple events. That's £40 right there, roughly a year's income from your estate if it's been a good year. Which it hasn't been. Your armour will need to be in perfect condition. That dent in the pauldron from training, that bent buckle on the sabaton. Those aren't just cosmetic problems in a real tournament. They're weaknesses that opponents will exploit and judges will notice. You need to pay the armourer to not just repair but polish and prepare everything. Another £2, probably 3. Thunder needs to be in peak condition, which means better feed for the month leading up to the tournament. New shoes, veterinary checks. If he goes lame or sick, you're not competing, and all your other expenses become total losses. You should probably bring a backup destrier, which means feeding and transporting 2 war horses. The costs are compounding faster than you can calculate. Then there's the entry fees. Lord Pembroke isn't hosting this out of generosity. He's making money off entry fees, concession sales, and the prestige of being the tournament host. Entry to the joust is probably £2. Entry to the melee is another £1. Various side competitions and demonstrations will have their own smaller fees. You're looking at £3 or £4 minimum just to participate. And here's the truly cruel part: you might lose everything. Tournament jousting is dangerous. Knights die regularly, not often, but often enough that everyone knows someone who took a lance through the visor slit or fell badly and broke their neck. More commonly, you get seriously injured. Broken arms, cracked ribs, concussions that leave you addled for weeks. If you're injured badly enough that you can't continue, all your expenses are losses with no chance of prize money to offset them. Even if you survive intact, you might just lose normally. Get eliminated in the first round win, nothing, go home poorer and humiliated. The prize money goes to the top few finishers, and the competition includes professional tournament knights, men who travel the circuit full time, who've honed their skills through dozens of events, who have better equipment and better horses and more experience than you'll ever have. Some historians argue that tournaments were essential for maintaining military readiness, that they served a vital social function in allowing knights to practice combat and display their prowess. Other scholars point out that by the later medieval period, tournaments had become more about conspicuous consumption and social networking than actual military training. Either way, they were expensive gambles that sent many knights into debt. You could decline. Send a polite letter saying you're needed at your estate, that duties prevent your attendance. But word would spread. Other knights would wonder if you're broke or cowardly or losing your edge. Marriage prospects, because your mother's right, you do need to marry someone, with money would dry up. Invitations to other events would stop coming. In the vicious social economy of knighthood, invisibility is the same as irrelevance. Or you could borrow money. There are money lenders in the larger towns, Jewish merchants who will lend to Christians at interest rates that would make modern loan sharks blush. 20%, 30%, sometimes more. You could mortgage your estate, promise future income against current loans, and hope that either you win prize money or that next year's harvest is good enough to cover your debts. This is how knights go bankrupt, one loan at a time, one tournament at a time, each gamble slightly more desperate than the last. You pick up the tournament summons again and read it for the dozenth time, as if the words might have changed. They haven't. Lord Pembroke still promises glory and honour and prizes. He doesn't mention the costs, the risks, the probability that you'll return home poorer and more desperate than when you left. Osbert knocks on your door. Sir Godfrey wants everyone in the yard. Evening drill. Because of course there's evening drill. Because the day isn't complete until you've suffered a bit more. You set down the summons, still undecided. 2 weeks until you need to give your response. 2 weeks to figure out if you're brave enough or stupid enough or desperate enough to gamble everything on a few minutes of competition against men who are probably better than you'll ever be. The answer should be no. The rational answer, the financially responsible answer, is to decline gracefully and preserve what little resources you have. But rationality and knighthood rarely occupy the same space. Honour demands you go. Reputation requires it. Your identity as a knight, fragile as it already is, depends on these public performances. You strap on your sword and head to the yard for evening drills. The tournament summons sits on your table unanswered, like a challenge you're not sure you can meet. The chapel bells ring for Compline, the final prayers of the day, and you're standing in the cold stone room again, this time with most of the household packed in around you. The day is finally winding down, but medieval Christianity doesn't let you simply collapse into bed. First you must account for your soul, confess your sins, and remind yourself that everything you've suffered today is nothing compared to the torments awaiting the wicked in the afterlife. It's motivational in the way a threat is motivational. The priest is elderly tonight, a different one from this morning, and his voice wavers as he leads the prayers. Te lucis ante terminum. Before the ending of the light we pray. The Latin flows over you, and you mouth along with the parts you've memorized through repetition, rather than understanding. Around you, other voices join in, some confident, some mumbling, some clearly just moving their lips and hoping no one notices. You're supposed to be thinking about God, about salvation, about your spiritual condition. Instead, you're thinking about how much your knees hurt against the stone floor, how your back is one solid mass of pain, how you still need to make a decision about the tournament right to your estate manager, about something you didn't understand, and somehow find the energy to wake up and do this all again tomorrow. But you stay kneeling because everyone stays kneeling, because leaving early would be noticed and commented upon. Because medieval piety was performed in public, and your relationship with God was somehow everyone's business. The church was not just about personal salvation, it was about social control, community cohesion, and demonstrating that you belong to Christian civilization rather than the chaos outside. The prayers shift to a litany of saints. The priest calls their names and the congregation responds with, Ora pro nobis, pray for us. Saint Michael, Saint George, Saint Maurice. Warriors and dragon slayers, the patron saints of men who kill for a living and need reassurance that God approves. You wonder if the saints are tired of being asked to pray for knights. If they're up in heaven thinking, another one, really can't these people just stop hitting each other? Medieval Christianity had a complicated relationship with violence. On one hand, thou shalt not kill was pretty explicit. On the other hand, crusades, holy wars, the entire concept of Christian knighthood that justified your existence. The solution was elaborate theological gymnastics. Killing was wrong, unless it was in service of the church or to protect the innocent or to enforce legitimate authority, or on Tuesdays if the victim deserved it. The moral flexibility was impressive. The priest is now talking about sin, his voice gaining strength as he warms to his favourite topic. Pride, lust, gluttony, sloth. The 7 deadly sins which apparently you've committed most of today. Pride in your status as a knight, even as you failed at basic combat. Gluttony at dinner, eating more than necessary. Sloth for wanting to sleep instead of attending prayers. You're probably going to hell and you're too tired to care. Historians still argue about how genuinely religious medieval people actually were. Some point to the ubiquity of churches, the popularity of pilgrimages, the elaborate religious art as evidence of deep faith. Others suggest that for many people, religion was more about social conformity and fear of punishment, go through the motions, because everyone goes through the motions, and the alternative is being ostracized or worse. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle. You believe in God mostly. You believe in heaven and hell, or at least you're not willing to bet against their existence. You believe that prayer probably does something, even if you're not entirely clear what, but you also believe that if God really cared about your spiritual development, he wouldn't have made being a knight quite so exhausting. The prayers conclude. Everyone makes the sign of the cross. You struggle to your feet, a process that takes longer than it should, and involves grabbing the pew in front of you for support. Other knights are doing the same thing, a room full of grown men moving like arthritic elderly people, because they've spent the day destroying their bodies in the name of martial readiness. You file out of the chapel behind the others, the cold night air hitting your face like a blessing. The courtyard is dark except for torches burning at intervals along the walls. Somewhere a dog barks, somewhere else a baby is crying. The castle settles into its evening routine, guards taking their positions, servants finishing final tasks, the gradual quieting that comes when people have exhausted themselves and sleep becomes the only remaining option. Your chamber is cold when you reach it. Osbert has left a single candle burning and laid out your night clothes, a long linen shirt that's cleaner than what you've been wearing all day, but still carries the faint smell of previous use. There's no fire in the brazier because fuel is expensive and you're not important enough to warrant warmth after sunset. You strip off your evening clothes with trembling fingers, your body temperature dropping immediately as you remove the layers. The nightshirt goes on quickly, and then you're under the wool blankets that smell like sheep and smoke, and your own accumulated sweat from previous nights. The straw mattress is compressed into its familiar uncomfortable lumps, but tonight even lumps feel acceptable because at least you're horizontal. Through the walls you can hear other sounds. Someone coughing, someone snoring. The guard calling out from the wall, "Walk that all is well," which is the medieval equivalent of a security system. Your mind tries to engage with the day's unresolved problems, the tournament, the letters, the bruises, the debt, the performance, but exhaustion is stronger than anxiety. Tomorrow will come in approximately 6 hours. The bells will ring. Osbert will wake you. The armour will go on. The suffering will continue. This is your life as a knight, an endless cycle of pain, performance and prayer with brief intervals of food and sleep. You close your eyes. The candle flickers in the draught. Sleep comes quickly because your body has no energy left to resist it. The day finally ends. 3 hours later, you're awake again. This is not dawn. This is not the bells calling you to prayer, or Osbert shaking you awake for another day of suffering. This is the middle of the night and you're staring at the ceiling in the darkness, because your body has decided that sleep is negotiable and pain is mandatory. Medieval sleep was not the uninterrupted 8-hour block that modern people expect. It was segmented, broken into what scholars call first sleep and second sleep, with a period of wakefulness in between. People would sleep for 3 or 4 hours, wake, naturally spend an hour or two, engaged in quiet activities, prayer conversation, light chores, conjugal relations, and then return to sleep until dawn. This pattern was so common that it had its own vocabulary. The time between sleeps was called the watching hour, or simply the watch. You're experiencing it now whether you want to or not. Your body has completed its first cycle of sleep, processed some of the day's physical trauma, and now it's awake and taking inventory of everything that hurts. Which is everything. Your shoulders throb from sword drills. Your ribs ache from where Sir Ralph hit you. Your thighs are tight from riding. Your back feels like it's been twisted into shapes the human spine was never meant to achieve. And there's a deeper exhaustion underneath all of it, a bone-deep weariness that suggests your body is reconsidering this whole being a knight situation. The chamber is utterly dark. No streetlights, no digital clocks, no ambient glow from electronics. Just darkness, so complete that you can't see your hand in front of your face. This kind of darkness is disorienting for a modern mind. Your brain keeps expecting your eyes to adjust, to find some source of light, but there isn't any. The candle burned out hours ago. The shutters are closed. You exist in a void where the only sensations are cold pain and the sound of your own breathing. Outside you can hear the night guard making his rounds, his footsteps echoing in the courtyard. He calls out something, probably the medieval equivalent of all's well, and another voice answers from across the castle. This happens every hour or so, guards confirming to each other that they're awake, that they're watching, that nothing terrible has breached the walls. It's simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. Why do they need to check so often? What might happen if they didn't? Medieval knights were dangerous. Not just from human threats, raiders, thieves, hostile neighbours, but from fire which could destroy an entire wooden structure in minutes. From illness, which often struck in the night and could kill before dawn. From accidents, people tripping in the darkness and breaking bones or falling downstairs. The night watch wasn't paranoia. It was survival insurance. Your bladder is making demands. The bucket in the corner of your chamber waits, but getting out from under the blankets means exposing yourself to air cold enough that you can see your breath, even in the complete darkness. You delay as long as possible, but eventually biology wins over comfort. You throw off the blankets and the cold hits like a physical blow. Stumbling to the bucket in pitch darkness is its own adventure. You bang your shin on the bed frame, knock over something that clatters across the floor, hopefully nothing valuable, and nearly trip over your discarded boots. When you finally reach the bucket and relieve yourself, the sound seems impossibly loud in the silent chamber. You half expect Osbert to burst in asking if everything's all right. Back under the blankets, shivering, you try to find warmth again. Medieval blankets were heavy wool, often weighing 10 or 15 pounds, the weight itself providing a sense of security. But they weren't particularly insulating by modern standards, and on cold nights, which most nights were, you woke up multiple times just from being cold. Some wealthy people had bed warmers, metal pans filled with hot coals that were moved through the sheets before sleeping. Some slept with their dogs, using the animal's body heat for warmth. Some wore caps and extra layers to bed. The poor simply huddled together in shared beds, using collective body heat to survive the night. Freezing to death in your sleep was a real possibility in the coldest months. People went to bed in autumn and simply didn't wake up come morning, their bodies discovered stiff and cold when the sun finally rose. Your mind, now awake, starts cycling through all the problems you fell asleep trying to ignore. The tournament decision, the estate correspondence you barely understood, the growing suspicion that you're not actually very good at being a knight, and eventually everyone will notice, the financial calculations that don't add up, the physical toll that's accumulating faster than your body can recover, the performance you'll need to deliver again in just a few hours, This is when the doubt creeps in, when the darkness and cold and pain combine into a question that you can't quite suppress. What if you're not meant for this? What if all the training and suffering and expense are just delaying? The inevitable realization that you're not knight material, that you're a mediocre fighter from a minor family trying to maintain a position. You're not qualified for. Medieval identity was inherited, not chosen. You're a knight because your father was a knight, because your family has held this position for generations. But inheritance doesn't guarantee competence. You could be terrible at this and still be obligated to continue trapped by birth into a role you can't fill adequately. The guard calls out again. Someone coughs in a nearby chamber. A dog howls somewhere in the village beyond the castle walls. The night moves slowly, measured not in minutes but in cycles of discomfort and brief warmth, wakefulness, and fitful dozing. Eventually you drift back to sleep, second sleep, though you don't have a name for it. Your body, exhausted beyond its capacity to stay awake despite the pain, shuts down again. The next thing you're aware of is Osbert's hand on your shoulder and pale grey light filtering through the shutters. Dawn. Again. The day begins exactly where yesterday ended in cold pain, and the certain knowledge that you're about to do it all over again. The politics of sleep in a medieval castle are more complex than you ever imagined, and you're learning them the hard way. Where you sleep with whom and under what conditions, all of it is a carefully calculated statement about your status, your relationships, and your place in the household hierarchy. And right now your sleeping arrangements are telling everyone that you're middle tier at best, possibly declining. You have a private chamber, which sounds impressive, until you realise it's barely larger than a modern closet, has no heat source, and shares walls so thin you can hear everything happening in the adjacent rooms. Privacy is relative. The walls are stone, but the door is wooden with gaps that let in drafts and sound. You're alone, yes, but you're alone in the way a fish in a glass bowl is alone, technically isolated, but completely visible to anyone who cares to look. The truly important knights sleep closer to the Lord's chambers. Physical proximity equals social proximity. If you're sleeping 2 doors down from the Lord, it means you're important enough to be summoned quickly, trusted enough to be nearby, valued enough to occupy premium space. You're sleeping 2 floors down and at the opposite end of the building. The message is clear: you're necessary, but not essential, employed, but not intimate, a functional part of the household, but not part of the inner circle. Some knights don't even get private chambers. They sleep in the great hall itself, rolling out pallets on the floor after dinner, sleeping among the servants and men-at-arms, in a communal arrangement that offers zero privacy and maximum humiliation. At least you've avoided that. At least you can pretend to dignity behind your thin wooden door. But here's what really keeps you awake during the watch hour. You might not keep even this chamber. Housing assignments are not permanent. They're rewards that can be withdrawn, privileges that must be constantly re-earned through performance and political manoeuvring. If you decline the tournament, if your combat performance continues to be mediocre, if you make the wrong enemy or fail to make the right friend, your chamber could be reassigned to someone more useful. You could find yourself back in the hall, sleeping on the floor with the common soldiers, your knightly status reduced to a technical title without practical privileges. Medieval households were constantly in flux. Knights came and went based on service obligations, economic necessity, and the Lord's favour. Your position here is not guaranteed. You serve at pleasure, not by contract. One bad season, one political miscalculation, one moment of visible weakness, and you could be encouraged to seek opportunities elsewhere. Medieval management speak for, "You're fired, but we're being polite about it." Some knights solved the housing problem by marrying well and establishing their own households. A wife with property meant a place that was actually yours, where you couldn't be evicted on a whim. But marriage requires money for the wedding money, to support a wife, money to maintain a household separate from your lord's, and you don't have money. You have debts, obligations, and a slowly deteriorating position in someone else's castle. Osbert sleeps in the servants' corridor on a pallet he rolls out each night and stores each morning. He doesn't complain about it because complaining would be pointless. Squires don't get chambers, don't get privacy, don't get anything except the promise that if they survive long enough, they might eventually become knights, who also don't get privacy, but at least get slightly better sleeping arrangements. The Lord himself sleeps in a proper bedchamber, with an actual bed, possibly even with a fireplace, certainly with tapestries on the walls to block draughts. His wife has her own chamber, separate sleeping arrangements being a privilege of the wealthy. Their children have chambers. Important guests get chambers. Everyone else negotiates for whatever space remains. This is what the songs don't tell you, that being a knight means constantly calculating your social position based on where you sleep, what you eat, where you sit at dinner, who acknowledges you in the corridor. Every spatial arrangement is a status announcement. Every housing assignment is a performance review. The castle itself is a three-dimensional organisational chart, and you're somewhere in the middle trying not to slide lower. You think about your grandfather, the one who fought at Crecy. Did he have these same anxieties? Did he lie awake in the night, wondering if he'd keep his chamber, calculating his position in the household hierarchy, worrying that one mistake would send him back to sleeping in the hall? Or was he confident enough in his abilities that he never doubted his place? The stories make it sound like knights were secure in their positions, certain of their value. The reality is that most knights lived in a state of constant low-grade anxiety about their status, their finances, their future. You could be one accident, one bad harvest, one political shift away from losing everything that made you a knight in anything but name. Right now, lying in your cold, small, thin-walled chamber, you're grateful to have even this much. The alternative, sleeping in the hall, your inadequacy on public display every night, is terrifying enough that you'll endure almost anything to avoid it. You'll accept the brutal training, the impossible expenses, the constant performance of competence you don't quite possess. Because the alternative is sliding down the social hierarchy until you're sleeping on the floor with men who used to be your equals and are now just reminders of what happens when you fail. The position you occupy is not just a sleeping space. It's a daily statement of your worth, a physical manifestation of how the household values you. And right now, that value is questionable enough that you can't afford any mistakes. Outside, the guard calls out again. The watching hour continues. You pull the blanket tighter and try to find warmth in wool that smells like disappointment and inherited anxiety. Tomorrow you'll perform competence again. Tomorrow you'll fight to keep your position, your chamber, your thin claim to knightly status. Tonight you're just cold and worried in a small stone room that you're not entirely sure you'll still occupy next month. Night watch duty rotates through the household nights on a schedule that seems designed to maximise suffering, while distributing it fairly. Every fourth night it's your turn to spend 4 hours standing on the wall, walk in the darkness watching for threats that probably won't come but might, and trying not to fall asleep while wearing armour in temperatures cold enough to freeze your breath. Tonight is your night, and it's past midnight, which means you're in the deepest part of the watch when the body most desperately wants to sleep and the mind starts playing tricks. You're stationed on the eastern wall overlooking the village and the fields beyond, though overlooking is generous when you can barely see 10 feet past the torchlight. The armour is necessary because if something does happen, raiders fire attack, you need to be ready to fight immediately. But armour and extended standing are bitter enemies. Your feet are going numb inside the sabatons. Your legs are trembling from holding yourself upright for 2 hours already. Your back is locked in a position that will require extensive stretching tomorrow to undo. And you have 2 more hours of this ahead of you. The other guard on this section of wall is Sir William, an older knight who's been doing this for 20 years and has developed the ability to sleep while standing with his eyes open. You're not sure if this is a skill or a symptom of profound exhaustion, but either way he's not much for conversation. He stands at his position 30 feet away, occasionally making the required call to the next section of wall, otherwise motionless as a statue. Medieval castle defence relied on this constant vigilance, guards watching through the night in rotating shifts, ensuring that no section of wall was ever unobserved. In practice, it meant a lot of cold-bored men fighting sleep and seeing threats in every shadow. The mind deprived of rest and stimulus starts creating its own entertainment. That tree in the distance moves. That shadow by the barn just shifted. Was that a voice, or just the wind? You walk your section of wall, maybe 50 feet of stone pathway between two towers, back and forth, trying to keep blood flowing to your extremities. The repetitive motion is hypnotic, and you have to keep shaking your head to stay alert. Falling asleep on watch is a serious offence, one that could result in punishment ranging from extra duty to actual violence, depending on how seriously the Lord takes security. Some castles under active threat maintained elaborate watch systems with passwords, frequent inspections, redundant guards. This castle, which hasn't seen real conflict in a decade, is more relaxed. The watch is maintained mostly out of tradition, and the vague awareness that the moment you stop watching is the moment something will go wrong. Medieval security was equal parts preparedness and superstition. The village below is completely dark. No lights except maybe 1 or 2 dim candles in windows where someone is sick or giving birth. Peasants couldn't afford to waste candles on staying up late. They slept when it got dark and woke when it got light, their schedules dictated by sun and season. Only the castle and church maintained lights through the night symbols of power and piety respectively. Your mind wanders to calculate how much this costs. The torches on the walls burn oil or pitch. The guard standing watch could be sleeping, recovering for tomorrow's work. The whole system of night defence is an expensive insurance policy against dangers that rarely materialise. But the one time you don't maintain watch is the one time raiders come or fire starts, or something goes catastrophically wrong. So you stand here freezing and exhausted just in case. A noise from the courtyard below makes you jump, but it's just a dog barking at shadows. Your heart is racing anyway, adrenaline spiking, because this is what extended boredom does. It makes you hypersensitive to any stimulus, interpreting everything as potential threat, because your brain is desperately seeking something to justify your continued wakefulness. Sir William calls out the hour, his voice echoing across the castle, answered by other guards in the distance. A chain of voices confirming that all sections are manned. All guards are awake, all is well. The medieval version of a security system check-in. You add your voice to the chain, shouting into the darkness, hearing your words carried away by the wind. 2 more hours. You try to think about something other than cold and tired. You think about the tournament decision which still isn't made. You think about your estate which might be collapsing while you stand here watching an empty field. You think about Osbert sleeping on his pallet, who will need to wake up in a few hours to prepare for another day. You think about the absurdity of your life standing on a wall in the middle of the night wearing 60 pounds of metal protecting people who are sleeping peacefully because they're not knights and don't have to do this. The wind picks up, cutting through even the armour. Your teeth are chattering. Your hands, even inside gauntlets, are losing feeling. This is how people die on night watch in winter, not from attacks or falls, but from simple exposure. Standing still for hours in freezing temperatures while wearing metal that conducts cold directly to your body. Guards have been found frozen at their posts, technically still on duty, having died standing up. You force yourself to move more, to walk your section faster, to flex your fingers and toes. Movement generates heat. Stillness is death. This is survival knowledge that every night guard learns or doesn't survive to regret. Finally you hear the bell for Lord's the pre-dawn prayer. Your watch is over. The next shift of guards climbs the stairs to replace you, their faces showing the same resignation yours must have shown 4 hours ago. You exchange nods with your replacement too tired for words and make your way carefully down the stone steps. Your legs barely work. You're stiff beyond anything training caused, but you're alive awake and you've completed another duty. Osbert will be getting up soon to prepare for the day. You have maybe an hour to collapse back into bed before it all starts again. This is the hidden cost of knighthood. The grinding, repetitive duties that have nothing to do with glory and everything to do with simply maintaining the system that maintains you. You're lying in bed after night watch, too cold and sore to sleep, but too exhausted to stay awake, and the realization hits you with the weight of all 60 pounds of armour you've been wearing. You wouldn't last a day as a medieval knight. Not really. Not if you're being honest with yourself. And that's because you've been transported here with your modern body, modern expectations and modern understanding of what life should be like. The real medieval knights, the ones who actually survived this life, started at 7 or 8 years old. They were pages first, learning to serve, to obey, to endure. Then squires at 14, building the muscle memory and physical conditioning over years of brutal repetition. By the time they were knighted in their late teens or early 20s, their bodies had been fundamentally reshaped by the life. Their hands were calloused beyond sensitivity. Their backs had adapted to carrying weight. Their minds had accepted that pain was constant and comfort was suspicious. You with your modern body used to chairs and climate control and 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep were doomed from the moment you woke up this morning. That first cold shock of stone floor beneath your feet. A medieval knight wouldn't have noticed the weight of the armour. They'd been wearing it progressively heavier for a decade. The exhaustion from sword drills. Their muscles had been built specifically for this repetitive motion since childhood. But it's not just physical. It's the mental endurance, the psychological framework that allowed medieval knights to accept their circumstances without the constant comparison to something better. They didn't know about heated homes or soft mattresses or the concept of weekends. This life, brutal, cold, painful, hierarchical, was simply life. They didn't spend their days thinking, this is terrible, because they had no reference point for not terrible. Either you're carrying the weight of knowing that life doesn't have to be this way, that somewhere in some other time people sleep through the night without freezing, that meals can be hot and flavourful, that reading and writing don't have to be mysterious arts practiced by specialists, that you could be warm, comfortable, rested, and still be considered a functional adult. This knowledge is its own torture. Every moment of medieval life is comparison, shopping against modernity, and modernity wins every single time. The bread is terrible compared to supermarket bread. The medical care is horrifying compared to modern medicine. The entertainment is tedious compared to literally anything with a screen. Even the best parts of medieval life, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the connection to tradition, are tainted by the awareness of what you're sacrificing to have them. The real truth, the one that the romantic medieval fantasies never mention, is that being a knight wasn't about glory or honour or noble quests. It was about endurance. It was about waking up every day in pain and choosing to continue anyway, because the alternative was social death, actual death, or the shame of your entire family line. It was about performing strength. You didn't always feel, projecting confidence you didn't possess, and maintaining appearances even when the economics didn't work and your body was breaking down and you couldn't remember the last time you felt genuinely warm. The knights who succeeded, who actually thrived in this system, were either born with physical advantages that made the suffering tolerable, or they developed psychological mechanisms that allowed them to find meaning in the brutality. They believed in the feudal hierarchy and divine right, in the notion that their suffering had cosmic significance. They bought into the ideology completely because the alternative was existential despair. Could you do that? Could you genuinely accept that your worth as a human is determined by your birth, that your function is to fight and possibly die for someone else's political interests, that your value is measured in your ability to wear metal and swing swords and endure cold stone floors without complaint? Could you live 20, 30, 40 years like this, watching your body deteriorate, your finances collapse, your options narrow, all while performing confidence and capability? The answer is probably no. Not because you're weak, though, by medieval standards you absolutely are, but because you know too much. You've tasted comfort. You've experienced the idea that life can be organised around human flourishing rather than human endurance. You've internalised concepts like personal choice, career satisfaction, work-life balance. These ideas are poison to medieval knighthood, which requires absolute acceptance of suffering as normal and necessary. So here you are 18 hours into being a medieval knight and you're already broken. Your body hurts everywhere. Your mind is exhausted from constant social calculation. Your spirit is crushed by the awareness that tomorrow will be exactly like today, and the day after that, and the day after that, until you're too old or too injured to continue, and you become one of those sad figures haunting the corners of castles, former knights living on charity and past glory. The bells are ringing again. Lauds, pre-dawn prayers. Osbert will be here soon to wake you properly to begin the armour process to start the cycle again. Outside your thin walls the castle is stirring. The kitchen fires are being built up. The stable boys are feeding horses. The whole medieval machine is grinding back to life. And you're just one small gear that's expected to keep turning. You close your eyes for the few remaining minutes of rest. Your body is a catalogue of pains. Your mind is a mess of unresolved anxieties. Your future is uncertain at best. And tomorrow, which is really just a few hours away, you'll get up and do it all again, because that's what knights do. They endure, they perform, they suffer with dignity. They maintain the elaborate fiction that they're warriors and nobles and heroes even when they're just tired men in expensive metal trying to survive another day. The glory, if it exists at all, is well hidden beneath layers of cold pain debt and exhaustion. And now you understand why you wouldn't last, not because you couldn't physically survive though. That's doubtful. But because you couldn't maintain the psychological delusion required to make this life meaningful. Medieval knights weren't stronger than you. They were just better at lying to themselves about what they were enduring. And maybe that's the real skill that separated successful knights from failures not sword technique or horsemanship, but the ability to wake up in a freezing stone room and convince yourself this was glory worth preserving. The candle in your chamber flickers one last time before going out, leaving you in complete darkness. Outside, the world is still that perfect quiet that comes just before dawn, when even the night guards are counting down their final minutes and the day guards haven't yet emerged. It's a moment suspended between ending and beginning, and for once there's no bell calling you to action, no Sir Godfrey demanding repetitions, no armour waiting to be donned. Just silence, just cold, just you lying in a medieval bed that will never be comfortable in a life that will never be easy, thinking about all the small ways that being a knight is nothing like the stories promised. The dragon slaying and maiden rescuing make up maybe 1% of the experience if you're extraordinarily lucky. The other 99% is this cold stone aching muscles, financial anxiety, social performance, and the grinding awareness that tomorrow you'll wake up and do it all again. But here's the strange thing, the thing that would keep medieval knights going despite everything. There's something almost meditative about the routine once you stop fighting it. The bells mark time, the prayers provide structure, the training builds something, even if it's just calluses and pain tolerance. In a world without clocks or schedules or the tyranny of infinite choice, there's a kind of peace in knowing exactly what comes next, even if what comes next is suffering. Modern life gives you options, possibilities, the burden of choosing who to become. Medieval knighthood gave you a role, a purpose, a place in the great chain of being from God down through king and lord to you, and then to the peasants below you. You might hate the role, might fail at. It might spend your whole life wishing you were somewhere else. But at least you knew what was expected. At least the path was clear, even if the path led through cold and pain and early death. The darkness in your chamber is absolute now, but outside the sky's beginning to lighten that deep blue that comes before grey, before pink, before the sun finally drags itself above the horizon to start another day. The birds are beginning their morning songs. Somewhere in the servants' quarters, Osbert is probably already awake, preparing himself for the ritual of preparing you. Soon the bells will ring. Soon the performance will begin again. But for now, for these last few minutes, you can simply exist, not as a knight, not as a social role, not as a collection of obligations and debts and performances. Just as a human being lying in the darkness, feeling the cold, knowing that you're alive, even if you're not particularly comfortable about it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all medieval knights really had, these quiet moments between the suffering, these pauses in the performance, when they could remember they were human beings, rather than walking symbols of feudal power. These brief respites when they could acknowledge the truth that they were tired and scared and in over their heads before putting on the armour and pretending otherwise for another day. The bells begin. Osbert's footsteps approach in the corridor. The day begins exactly where the last one ended, and you impossibly somehow find the strength to face it one more time, because that's what people do, medieval or modern. They wake up, they endure, they find small moments of meaning in the spaces between the pain. Your eyes close, your breathing slows, and for just a moment more before the world demands your attention again, you rest. Sleep well, traveller. Tomorrow you can go back to being yourself, comfortable, warm, with access to coffee and proper mattresses, and the luxury of complaining about problems that aren't, how do I survive the next 12 hours in 60 pounds of metal? Medieval knights couldn't escape their lives. But you can. That's the beauty and the horror of it. You can close this story, turn off the light and return to a world where being cold is a choice, rather than a constant where pain can be medicated, where tomorrow doesn't have to be an exact copy of today's suffering. So rest. Let the medieval world fade back into history where it belongs, and be grateful, genuinely grateful that you were born in an age where central heating exists, where literacy is common, where you can be tired without also being cold, hungry, in debt, and obligated to stand on a wall in the darkness waiting for threats that probably won't come. The story ends here. The night you survived one day barely, which is more than many modern people could claim. That's something. That's enough. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.